time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning, David Montgomery. David Montgomery is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is the author of multiple books, including Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, The Rocks Don't Lie, a geologist investigates Noah's flood, King of Fish, The 1,000-Year Run of Salmon, The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health, which he co-authored along with Anne Bickley and was on the show, both were on the show about a year ago. And he is here to talk about his new book, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. David, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Well, sure. It's a pleasure to be back.
Appreciate you coming in at the early hour. So start out, tell us, what was your motivation in writing your new book, Growing a Revolution?
Well, about a decade ago, I wrote that book, Dirt, that you mentioned, and it looked at how society after society had degraded their soil through farming practices, and that limited the lifespan of civilizations. And as you might imagine, it was kind of a difficult book to write the ending of. It was a little depressing to that look back through history and to see that those kind of connections that environmental degradation had really impacted human history to that extent. And I sort of put the issue aside for a few years and then started gradually hearing talks from farmers that had restored fertility to their soil. And my wife restored fertility to our yard, as we talked about in The Hidden Half of Nature the last time that Ann and I were both in. And started to gradually realize that the restoring fertility to the world's soils was actually potentially feasible to do in a very short time frame, surprisingly fast for a geologist like me who thinks it takes thousands of years to build a soil. And so a lot of the motivation was to try and look at how could we actually solve this problem of long-term soil degradation? Because if you look at the big problems we face in the 21st century environmentally, we all know about the climate issue. We all know about the population issue. The one that really does, and we know about fresh water and its availability. The one that doesn't get a whole lot of attention is what's happened to the world's soils. Yet if you look at what the state of the world's soils, we've lost or degraded somewhere between a third and half of the world's topsoil over the course of human history, much of it in the last century since the development of modern agriculture. How to actually turn that around and rebuild fertility so we could not only feed, the 8, 9, 10 billion people we expect to have on this planet by mid-century, but keep doing so thereafter as our supply of cheap oil that we use to basically subsidize modern agriculture dwindles. To me, that's the real challenge, how we actually keep agriculture sustainable. And that's what I really tried to wrestle with in this book. And it turned out to be a surprisingly optimistic book because I think it's a problem we can actually solve.
Did you expect that it would be a good news story?
Well, it took me a long time to get there. But once I got into it and started visiting farmers and started to frame the book, I was starting to realize, there's a spark here that may really work. I was surprised at how universal the principles that underpinned the efforts of those farmers who were really turning around their farms and their soil were fairly fast. I was surprised at how scalable it was, and I was surprised that it actually is economical to do today on small farms and large farms, that farmers can make more money doing it, which is why, at the title Growing a Revolution, I really think that there is the potential for a ground-up, if you pardon the pun, farmer-led revolution in terms of how we look at modern agriculture, because they can do better in a way themselves on their own farm economics in ways that actually lower their environmental footprint. And it all comes down to the fact that inputs, the fertilizer, the diesel, the insecticides, the pesticides, the herbicides, those have all gotten really expensive while farmers have become very good in the commodity crop world at producing things so the price they get for their harvest has gone down. That squeezes them in the middle. And so if the people who selling them the agrochemicals or buying the commodity crops are doing just fine, the farmers' margins have been squeezed. And that's part of the story about why family farms in America have been dwindling since the Second World War, that sort of squeeze play, if you will, on farmers. So what's the way out? Well, if you could figure out a way to farm that used less of those expensive inputs but maintained the yields, maintained harvests, then the bottom line for farmers is improved. They can make more money. And that's essentially where we've gotten to, is that some farmers have figured out creative ways to actually to work that. And I went around and visited farmers who have been successful at doing that and tried to look for the general patterns. What are the general principles that underpin success? And once I started to realize that those principles are universal, that the different practices may be different, but it can scale to farms of different sizes, that they can work on farms of different technological sophistications. You would just do it differently, say, on a farm in Ghana than a farm in North Dakota, but that the principles were the same. That's when I started to realize that, wow, this actually is an optimistic story, because we can solve these problems, and there's people around the world who are actually doing it. It's not a pie-in-the-sky hypothesis. You can go to real farms, talk to real people who've already done it.
So when you say short term, obviously you're a geologist. So what is that for the rest of us here on the planet?
Well, the standard idea that if you go to a geological textbook of how long it takes to make an inch of fertile soil, you'll come up with an answer of centuries, and that's, to a geologist, that may be short, but to a farmer or a policy-oriented person, that's kind of like forever. I was really quite surprised at how fast this can be turned around. We're talking about a couple years, 2 to 3, 4 years on some of the farms I went to, where you would start to see the effects of soil building practices return in terms of yields that come back to close to what they're getting under conventional practices. So there's a very short period of depression in yields that come with conversion to these practices. The trick seems to be that you need to convert to a full set of 3 practices that involve not tilling the soil, integrating cover crops into the practices, keeping the ground covered, and then also diversifying the rotation, growing a diversity of crops. And the farmers who had adopted all 3 of those measures saw a rapid rebuilding of fertility of their soil. And it does take time, right? There's improvements that continue to play out over 20, 30 years. It's not an overnight process. But the initial returns to start to see improvement that actually pencils out for their bottom line really only took a couple years.
So talk more about each of the 3 aspects to this. So tilling, and in this case, not tilling, is a key component. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it's really foundational. That was one of the, if you look back at my dirt book from a decade ago, the villain in the story, if you will, was the plow. And if you look at the history of agriculture, which that book essentially was, it's kind of a surprising villain, because if you listen to country music, what do farmers do? They plow, well, and drive pickup trucks and drink and all that stuff. But it's an icon. You look at the seal of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. What's on it? Thomas Jefferson's plow. I mean, it is, when we think of farming, we think of plowing. And if you think of the sort of philosophy that underpins modern, what we call modern farming, conventional farming, it is tillage-based, it's plow-based. It involves growing 1 or 2 crops. It's a very narrow diversity, and we don't plant cover crops in between crops. We just plant our crop, then we plow it up. Well, what happens when you plow? It turns the earth over, and it leaves it bare and vulnerable to erosion by wind or rain for some period of time, and that causes erosion. Because we've all driven past construction sites and seen the brown water running off of that when you get a good rain onto a disturbed surface. That can't go on for very long geologically before you lose the soil. So foundationally, if we're going to keep soil covered on our agricultural fields, we need to reduce plowing. But also think about what happens to all the life in the soil when you pass a plow through it. One of the things that that botanists and agronomists have learned over the past several decades is the extent to which mycorrhizal fungus in the soil, partners with the plants. And this is part of what we were talking about in the Hidden Half of Nature last year, I think, when we were in, is the way that the fungi in the soil will actually go out and scavenge things like phosphorus or copper, selenium, the sort of elements out of the mineral soil, bring them back and trade it to a plant for the sugar that the plant has the ability to make because it's photosynthetic. So you think about it, the plant is stuck in place. It can't just go to the store and get its micronutrient supplements that it needs, right? But it can send fungus off to essentially grow out and harvest that for them, and they pay them off with sugar. And so there's these symbioses, these collaborations that happen between plants and the fungus and the soil. So what happens when you pass a plow through a field where you had a crop that had these partnerships with fungi in the soil? Well, you chop the fungus up, and you basically break that delivery system that's connecting the sources of nutrients out in the soil to the crop. And that can reduce the flow of micronutrients that are getting from out of the minerals and into the plants, so that we have less of those micronutrients in the food that we're then eating. But it also challenges the plant in other ways. So, plowing has all these downsides. Now, so you might ask, well, why did people plow? Why is it this iconic activity? It's really good weed suppression. And so if you think from a practical viewpoint of what does a farmer need to do, you need your crop to beat the weeds, because if the weeds beat your crop, you're out of business. And a plow is a really good way to do it. You plow it up, you plant your seeds, so the first thing that comes up is what you want. But it turns out that there's other ways to farm that don't involve plowing that can also provide very effective weed suppression. For example, herbicides are a great way to suppress weeds. And so, ironically, one of the reasons behind the increase in no-till agriculture, this are non-tillage, non-plow-based agriculture in the U.S., was the development of herbicides in the 1970s, culminating with glyphosate that's now sort of sprayed on almost everything. But there are other ways to actually do that, to provide effective weed suppression. And cover crops is one that has been increasingly looked at and experimented with, because if you think about a field where you've planted, say, corn, and then there's going to be a period before your next crop. If you plant a cover crop in between, and then you knock it down with, say, a crop roller, what you've done is you've grown your crop. It's taken all the elements it needs out of the soil, got them into the plant, and then you kill that plant before you plant your next commercial crop. All those nutrients that have gotten into biological circulation, gotten out of the mineral elements, out of the mineral particles in the soil, and into a plant. When the plant rots, they are then soluble, and another plant can take them back up through their roots. So the cover crops can protect from erosion, but they also enhance just pulling nutrients from the soil and getting it into that biological circulation. So there's farmers I visited in Ohio, say, where they were using radishes to essentially mine mineral elements out of their subsoil, bring them up into their topsoil. Then they wouldn't harvest the radishes. In fact, one gentleman I visited was quite surprised when he pulled one out and told me, you could sell that for like $5 in the farmer's market in Seattle. This is like a beautiful radish. And he was like, well, that's to feed my soil. Isn't it? It's not. He didn't have a market for it. But so if we think of farming as the process of cycling nutrients out of the broken down elements in the rocks that become the soil, the biology becomes really central to how that works. And modern farming, in many regards, has in the early 20th century became enmeshed with the philosophy that it's mostly chemistry and physics that drives fertility. And those are really important things. The way water moves through a soil, the nature of the soil, what the chemistry of the rocks were that broke down. It's all critically important to soil fertility, but the biology is equally important. And we're just coming back around to learning that. And so the two problems with the plow, to get back to your original question, are the disturbance and the erosion that can accompany the use of it, and the breaking up of the biological relationships that nature has used to create abundance and fertility in the partnership between plants and soils that have evolved over geologic time. So it's the walking away from the plow, ditching the plow, really is a fundamental philosophical shift that's foundational to the style of farming that I view as regenerative, that can actually rebuild soil fertility as a consequence of intensive agriculture, which, if you think about sustaining a planet full of people with abundant food at reasonable environmental cost, that's the way to go. And in fact, one of the things I'm excited about is that these techniques, I think, can turn farming from something that is an environmental detriment to something that actually builds environmental quality, can help sequester carbon in the soil, can help increase biodiversity on our farms and fields. And, like something like a quarter of the world's continental areas is now devoted to growing food for people. So the future of biodiversity is in some ways very tightly connected to the future of life on farms. And these methods and techniques actually promote the development of predators to take out take out pests and pathogens. It can build biodiversity. But anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
So primarily then the till was just used for the concept of the weeds, competing with the weeds. So
well, yeah, seedbed preparation, make it easy to plant. But the really big value to farmers over the long haul has been weed suppression. And so getting clever with other ways to do that has actually been central to the farmers adopting this new suite of practices. And the combination of new equipment that's actually available for doing no-till planting, so you can plant seeds without tillage, and the combination of combining that with the experience of what kind of cover crops to use has really been quite effective.
And I would imagine there is some perk from not using, at least in terms of tilling on larger industrial-sized farms, not using that heavy equipment is going to save us on the fuels and different oil-based products that those are sucking up and then spewing back out into the environment.
Yeah, some of the farmers that I visited had reported that they were using about half the diesel that they had used before, because by not tilling, they're saving passes of the tractor across the fields. And diesel is one of the big costs, input costs in modern farming. So if you can save half, you've done very well. It's also, they've saved a lot on herbicides. And the ones that have adopted the full suite of practices save a lot on fertilizer, and they save a lot on insecticides, because after the soil is essentially, once its fertility is rebuilt, the plants are more resilient, and you don't have as many opportunities for pests and pathogens to affect them. And if you have a rotation that has more than one or two crops in it, then by the time the pest that landed on your crop last year rehatches in the same field, some other crop's there the next year, and there's no habitat for them. And that's actually really effective pest control. You can sort of view pest control as either you try and kill them all or you deny them habitat. And with a complex rotation, you're denying them habitat up front, so you don't need as much of the expensive chemical inputs that are used with the other philosophy. So one of the things that I thought was really, really essential to this new view of farming that I'm talking about in the book is that it's more profitable for farmers. And that translated across whether on small farms in Africa, where the subsistence farms, where there was essentially no capital to invest in proprietary seeds or in fertilizers, a very limited amount for herbicides. If they can basically increase their harvests without increasing their outlays, they do better. Same thing on large farms in North America, where if harvest can be maintained and input costs radically reduced, it's more profitable for the farmers. And so this is one of the few things I think we can point to, or one of the few points in history where the economics short-term for farmers are starting to line up with the long-term interests of society in terms of maintaining the fertility of our soil and reducing erosion, of course, as well. And it's that confluence where people can do better, or do well by doing better, I guess the phrase is where I think there's a real exciting opportunity. I think we need to figure out how to operationalize practices in different regions that follow this basic three-principle set, and encourage farmers to adopt all three, because it's a system. It's like a stool. You need all three legs for it to work well. If a farmer just goes to no-till but doesn't involve the cover crops and doesn't diversify rotations, it may not improve yields or improve soil quality all that much. Same with each of those other ones individually. But what do scientists tend to study? We break problems into individual pieces so we can control things, and we don't tend to study system interactions as often as we do the individual pieces. So as I looked into researching this book, and what I did is I went around and visited farmers who had done this, pulled off the restoration of their soil, and the results were amazing on some of these farms, and asked the question of, well, what did you do? How did it work? What were the general principles? And there were very few. And then I also went to the scientific literature and said, okay, well, are there other independent things that kind of back up what these people are telling me? And there was a lot of evidence, but it was in little pieces, and there were very few studies that have actually looked at the performance of the system as a whole. You'll find things on no-till or on cover crops or on crop rotations. But the few places I could find where people had actually studied the interaction of all three, the results pretty much lined up with what what the farmers who had done this were telling me. So I did a bit of intellectual triangulation and a lot of visiting and listening. And the book is essentially trying to distill that story and put it in the broad context and sweep of human history, why this actually really is pivotal.
So I can't imagine that this is good news for those corporations that supply large scale farming equipment and or pesticides or GMO seeds?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. If you're going to convert from tillage-based farming to no-till farming, you actually need different farm equipment. So there's a capital cost involved in that, and there are companies who are quite happy to manufacture and sell that equipment and are doing well with it, actually. There's probably the folks who might be least excited about this are fertilizer dealers and people who are selling insecticides and herbicides. And I intentionally did not go out and visit alternative farming advocates. I visited the Rodale Institute, the Organic Institute in Pennsylvania, and an agroforestry permaculture operation down in Costa Rica. But most of the farms that I visited were conventional farmers who had adopted this suite of practices and thereby almost weaned themselves off of agrochemicals. So they were not organic. I labeled them organic-ish because some of them just did not want, culturally did not want to be organic farmers, didn't want to be associated with that. It was just not them. But I would ask them, you've cut your use of this stuff by 90% or so, and you're doing well. Why not actually cut the rest out and take the price premium you would get for having organic certification? And you got various answers. It's like, what I'm doing is better than organic, so why would I pay somebody to certify that it was better? But the thing that really impressed me was that how much they were able to cut their use of those inputs by rebuilding the fertility of their soil. And if you run an experiment, if you go out to somewhere in the world where you have very native rich soil, you find one of the last places of intact prairie soils in the American Midwest, for example, you didn't need fertilizer and an herbicide to farm it and produce a lot of food when you had that original really fertile soil. In fact, if you add fertilizer to an already very fertile soil, you get no benefit. You're just spending your money on fertilizer. And so why did we adopt very chemical-intensive agriculture in the 20th century? Because we had degraded our soils over the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. We were in a position where if you add a lot of fertilizer to a very degraded soil, you'll grow more crops. And there's differences between growing a lot and or between sort of quantity and quality, if you will. But we've tended to focus on growing quantity, on crop yields, rather than the nutrient density or the quality of produce. And a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers and potassium, the NPK that you see in a bag of fertilizer you might get from a nursery, for example, you add that stuff to a soil and you can grow bigger plants. You can grow more yield if you're working with a degraded soil. But if you restore fertility to your soil, you don't need as much of those things. And so most of the farmers I visited still used some fertilizer, still used some herbicide, maybe some insecticide if they felt they needed it in one particular year. But they all approached it with the philosophy of, I want to use as little as possible. Mostly because they didn't want to spend money on it, but also because they thought it was the right thing to do for their land, because they had adopted a new philosophy of farming that emphasized soil health, that was the lens through which they viewed what they did on their land, is that they were basically trying to build the health of their soil because they believed that would then support their efforts to grow crops and to grow healthy, nutrient-rich food. And from the stuff that we were talking about last year in the hidden half of nature and the way that microbes interact with the soil and the plant roots, the science actually backs that up and makes a lot of sense. The particular practices you'd use to build soil health in different environments at different scales, at different technologies are different, but those general principles really seem to translate across the board.
So I have heard and read where with our current path in terms of climate change, that we're looking at certain parts of the globe which are productive currently in terms of having relatively decent soil are potentially going to become deserts. Do you see this as a type of mitigation that we could employ towards maybe pushing that back?
Well, you can use these kind of techniques to try and restore fertility to places that have been degraded, so the desertification issue. for many of those areas that are most vulnerable, you're dealing with many of the world's grasslands. And in those areas, it's worth thinking about, well, what kind of grazing practices could actually be used, not to degrade the land as they have often in the past, but to rebuild the fertility of those soils. And that was one of the other things I was looked at in the book. That actually really quite surprised me, because I did some of my PhD work down in the California Coast Range, where I was looking at gullies that formed when the Spanish brought their dairy cattle in and really, blew out the valley bottoms in Marin County where I was studying. And so I was thinking, oh, well, cows are bad. They cause erosion. They're an agent of destruction. And, you poll most geologists, physical geographer types, and they'd probably give you a similar answer, because there's a lot of examples you can point to where overgrazing has degraded the soil. So I was actually quite surprised to visit a ranch in North Dakota and the one in Saskatchewan, where they had adopted very different grazing practices that at first sounded kind of counterintuitive, but that had almost restored their soil from a very degraded condition to a condition not unlike the historical condition when it was first, when European settlers first arrived in those regions. And so what was their trick? Well, they basically emulated the grazing practices of the buffalo that had originally worked that area and that were responsible in part for helping to build the rich, fertile grassland soils of the prairies. So how does it work? If you think about where most of the biomass in prairie grasses are, it's below ground. And why would a plant park most of its biomass below ground? Well, because the buffalo came by and ate everything that stuck up above every year. And the buffalo would come through, graze everything basically to the ground, and then they'd move on and they wouldn't come back for a year. And it turns out that what that does to a plant, you can actually run experiments where you take a plant and you mow it, you cut the grass with scissors or a mower-like thing, or you chomp it with what would be teeth and trample it with hooves. The trauma from the chomping and the trampling causes the plants to push more exudates, more sugar out into the soil to feed the microbes and the fungi that will go get all the elements from the mineral soil that the plant needs to rebuild itself. And so it's that stimulation from that horrible trauma of it being intensively grazed that triggers the plant, this chain reaction between the plant and the microbes and the soil back to the microbes back to the plant that allows the plant to come back and grow with a healthy vengeance. But what's the trick? Well, the buffalo didn't come back for a year. So you had this intense disturbance for a very short period of time, then you left it alone. How have we tended to graze? Well, what the Spanish did in California that caused the incision of the valley bottoms and the gullying there is they left their cows in the valley bottom because that's where the water was. So the cows are in the same place all the time, all year. So you had perpetual disturbance, not this short-term disturbance with a long recovery time. So what these ranchers had done was essentially go to moving their cows around every day. So they grazed the hell out of a small piece of ground every day, and then they moved to a new paddock, and they did it all with electric fences and wires and solar-powered latches that could help move the cows around. The cows almost moved themselves around. And by doing that, they essentially could graze their whole ranch, but they could almost double the amount of livestock they were running, and they were building the fertility of their soil. They'd taken it from less than 1% organic matter when they started in the a couple decades ago, up to the point where they're now anywhere from 5 to, in one field, up to almost 10% organic matter. That's the range of values for native prairie. So they'd almost fully restored their soil and increased the amount of livestock they were running on it. So it really taught me that the problem wasn't cows per se, wasn't livestock per se, it was how we grazed them. And so it's very parallel to the issue of cropping, where we can, by the way we grow our food, we can actually rebuild the fertility of our soil and improve its quality, and thereby even grow more of it. It's all about how we do it and understanding the nature of the system. And that's where this new philosophy and new way of looking at farming, I think, could be truly transformative. Because if we're going to ever actually get to a really sustainable agriculture, it's going to have to be an agriculture that does not degrade soil as a consequence of farming. We need to build fertility as a consequence of intensive farming. And that's exactly what these farmers around the world that I visited had done.
All right. Well, with that, we're pretty much out of time. We're talking with David Montgomery. He's author of the new book, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. And you are doing a talk this coming week, I believe, at Town Hall Seattle. Is that right?
Yeah, Tuesday night, May 9th, I believe it is. I'll be talking at Town Hall at about 7 o'clock, and I'll probably play a little bit of music in the run up to that as well, which ought to be fun.
Because you're a musician.
Yeah, playing a band called Big Dirt. That's a local band, and it's a lot of fun. But yeah, we'll be mostly talking about the new book. It's the book release party, so it should be fun. It'll be a nice kickoff. Be great to see people there.
All right. And you also have a website, too. Is that right?
Yes, it's dig2grow, dig, the number 2, grow.com. And we're active on Twitter. Our handle's at dig2grow, or Facebook, same deal, dig2grow. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, we'll when we find things of interest, we send them on and encourage people to check it all out.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
No worries. It's a pleasure. Always glad to talk to you.